Alan, let's start with you, sir. The role of trade. I mean, trade has been the backbone of globalization in a sense, and vice versa. But Alan, how the recovery of trade in the post-pandemic world has become one of the big talking points.
It has, though I would say that the pandemic is actually the least of it. Now, I've been looking at this stuff on and off for a long time, and I have heard people call the death of trade and the death of globalization more generally, right? Not just goods, but services, capital, people. And I'm sure you remember as well as I do, globalization was going to end after 9/11. Remember that? There was going to be sand in the wheels of globalization. It was going to end. It was going to end with the SARS and bird flu outbreaks of the 2000s. It was going to end in the food crisis, 2002. 2007-8. It was definitely going to end the global financial crisis. I'm sure lots of people here remember it was certainly going to end after the Icelandic ash cloud, and then it was going to end during COVID. And now, as a result of the Ukraine war, it's actually come through all of those remarkably well. It's changed a bit along the way.
Yeah, no, how's it changed?
So it's changed because, not actually due to any of those shocks, but goods trade, relative to overall growth, eased off. It kind of leveled off relative to overall growth. But that was nothing to do with any of those shocks, really. That was simply, to put it very crudely, Asia ran out of cheap workers. The labor cost arbitrage, and that started before the global financial crisis. So, you know, China didn't continue to make everything and export it. Its domestic industry, its domestic market grew and so forth. So those things have changed and evolved, and that's kind of fine. The threat, I would say now, to growth and to globalization isn't actually to do with technology, or really even energy. We can talk about that. It's to do with politics. Because you've seen, for the first time since the Cold War, a really determined attempt by really very serious governments, the United States, to use their regulatory power, fiscal power, financial power, to pull apart at least part of it, to decouple supply chains, to run a very determined industrial policy.
Which we'll come to just, the IRA is essentially the CHIP Act and all the other various things. In terms of the WTO, I mean, you've been banging on about trying to, you've sort of given up on a major trade round after the last one ended in tears and gnashing and wailing of teeth. And the best that seems to happen now is this nibbling away. Oh yes, trade facilitation, trade, all very important, but does it advance the agenda?
I mean, let me maybe start by addressing that, but I also want to briefly comment on what Alan said. But you bring it up. There's all this talk of the WTO being irrelevant and of things not moving ahead in Geneva and so on. And I mean, I get it. We have some difficulties. But one important number that I would like to leave with you is that 75% of world trade is still conducted under MFN terms, despite all the tensions we are having, despite all the trade wars we are seeing. 75%. So it's still the backbone of globalization, and I think it's still something that is worth preserving. But if I may briefly comment on what Alan said, I very much agree with the diagnosis, and it's actually an important point to make that despite the talk we hear about deglobalization, fragmentation, crisis, and so on, the actual numbers are actually not so bad. And that's an important consideration. And I also agree that the risk is really on the political side.
Yeah, but you see, I would say the numbers have held up in spite of,
yes,
not because of.
Yes, totally.
And if those of us who sort of covered the Trump years and the very quick, Alan, ratcheting up of classic protectionist activities, many of which have not been reversed, EU or China related, sets a very dangerous framework for the future.
It does. It has a very dangerous mindset for the future. I mean, I think it's remarkable how even despite that, even during all the Trump years, trade continued reasonably strongly. Because what Trump was doing was extremely crude. Didn't really understand a lot of what he was doing. Just whacked on tariffs across the board, not understanding that would divert trade. It would not. What you're seeing for the Biden administration is much smarter and potentially, I'm not sure if I call it damaging, but potentially much more effective, which is, let me just go on a slight disquisition here, which is, I've tried to stop myself using the term supply chain, right? Because it's a really bad metaphor. A chain is like that, right? And the weakest link snaps and that's it, right? The global economy, we have discovered over the last quarter century, is not like that at all. It's an ecosystem, it's a network. It goes like this, right? And if one node snaps, that's fine, other ones grow around it. But what you see with the Biden administration, and indeed with China to some extent, is an intelligent agency which says, right, no, we're going to snap that bit. Oh, is that going to go back? Fine, we're going to snap that bit. We're going to direct that bit.
To what end?
That bit. To the end of, so they would say, maintaining vital technologies. However, their definition of vital technologies spreads way beyond military to, anything that they will suffer if the import of it gets blocked.
Point taken, but it's a valid point from these governments. However uncomfortable in Geneva it might be, it's a valid point that when the pandemic hit, we were in the shit. We suddenly found that we couldn't get PPE. The PPE we did get, we didn't know what its provenance was or its efficacy. Therefore, we need to onshore and friendshore and reverse a generation of outsource.
I mean, I wouldn't say so, no. I mean, it's true that, trade was part of the problem at the beginning of the pandemic, and we did see the supply chain disruptions. But at the end of the day, I mean, how did you get your face masks? How did you get the home office equipment that you needed to work at home? How did you get the vaccines? At the end of the day, through trade. So I think trade at the beginning, might have been part of the problem, but in the long run, it was a huge part of the solution. And if I may, I think that's really what's underlying this whole globalization crisis, is that, we have three key challenges that we need to overcome. Overcome. So we need to achieve a sustainable economy, we need to maintain peace and security, and we need to reduce poverty and inequality. And people perceive trade as part of the problem for all those three things. And indeed,
Well, yes,
I think it's part of the solution.
No. Because in many of the developed economies, the promotion of free trade policies and the lack of proper social welfare policies to support those who suffered meant large numbers of people were thrown out of work and there was no response.
The vast number of economists would tell you that's not true.
Yeah.
Most jobs that look like they're lost through trade are lost through technology. Right? The reason there were no textile workers left in the United States is not China. Right? It is technology. It is the fact that things have become much more mechanized. There's a wonderful saying that someone in the Obama administration used to use: everybody's against trade, right? Because no one gets a vote on technology. And just go back to this previous point about PPE. Part of the problem here is that, yes, you can see what looks like a failure. It looks like a supply chain failure, and your solution might actually make it worse. The solution with PPE is not for everyone to make their own PPE. And remember that there were barriers within the European Union to this, right? Macron was impounding face masks on the tarmac at Lyon. So are you really saying that every EU member state, Luxembourg, has to have its own face mask or manufacture? Or is the solution actually, during times of peace, as it were, to buy loads of it and stockpile, import loads of it and stockpile?
Yeah.
But you don't always know what you're going to need.
No, but we know, we did actually know. We should have known that there was a lot of, and that gains. Also, you don't know what you're going to need, so you can't produce it either. I mean,
Right, but
everything you might conceive.
I want to go back to your point,
Yeah.
I take this with great trepidation because you've been looking at this for so long, and you're such a renowned expert on this. But Alan, what do you say to those workers in the American Midwest or the British Northeast who say, my job was screwed by the Chinese, the Indians, delete where applicable?
Fortunately, I'm not a politician, so I don't have to craft a message. But the problem is, you have to craft a message which, unfortunately, either says you're wrong, that's not actually what happened, or you have to craft a message that's some tangent to that. And I know people like this are sick of hearing this and saying, those jobs, for whatever reason those jobs have gone, we need to find something else, okay? The shipbuilding jobs went in Sunderland, okay? What they do in Sunderland now, they build cars really successfully, okay, when governments don't get in the way with ridiculous things like Brexit. See, we've got to Brexit. And normally I time all meetings I do now to see how long we get. On this occasion, I'm afraid to say it was me that broke the tradition.
Yeah, you took us there.
But
the point is, a lot of these places, they have some infrastructure, they have skills, they have industrial traditions that can be turned to other things if people are nimble enough and if governments are supportive enough.
Okay,
Yeah, you keep going on about this point, about trade and inequality, and I mean the session here is called the big picture. So let's think about the big picture for a minute. It's true that trade caused some problems in the United States, in the north of Britain, and it's true that there were many other drivers of it. But think about the big picture. I mean, people call this the China shock even, which I think is really kind of a shocking terminology, because the big picture is that trade helped China grow, which in turn lifted hundreds of millions of people out of poverty and provided hope to nations around the world. And all we focus on is, some people, industrialized countries.
Because, as Tip O'Neill said, all politics is local.
Okay, but you have to take a bit of a broader view, no? I mean, it's not just
right.
It's not just about. I mean, and I don't want to say it's not important. I think it's very important to think about, the disruptions in U.S. labor markets, to do something about it. But the big picture is, I mean, it's a complete game changer through trade.
And an actual answer to this is, if you look as an example within the European Union, those countries which are sustainably the biggest supporters of free trade tend to be the northern liberal type countries, the Scandinavian countries like Denmark, Sweden, and so forth. They have big welfare states. They have welfare states which are very good, and particularly Denmark, at redistributing people from one job to another. Okay, and so I think that big welfare states, big active welfare states, and globalization are complementary.
So you heard in my report Scott Kirby of United saying that the IRA was the game changer. Now, the IRA, I mean, it's such a vast, along with the CHIP Act, they're both such vast pieces of legislation in terms of strategic development that we're not going to really know the full implications for some years to come. Europe's response, Alan, is we've got to do something. We're not going to do a single big like that, but we're going to do it piecemeal.
Yeah, so the problem that the EU has is it's often focused on leveling the playing field between the member states. So it has state aid rules. The function of state aid rules is to stop Germany and France out subsidizing everyone else. And so they have all of that focus, which means that it's hard, and the money literally doesn't exist at an EU level to respond. I was talking to the French about this recently, and of course the French always want to centralize everything and spend more money. And they had this idea of a fund which they started off calling a fonds souverain. Right? This went down extremely badly because everyone went, sovereign fund? What? So we don't have sovereign wealth funds, this is Europe. And they had to change it to Fonds de Souveraineté, right? A sovereignty fund. And even then they find it difficult getting through. Part of the problem is that there's just a difference there's a mismatch in what each can do. The EU has rules traditionally, and the US has cash. The EU has priced carbon. That's a really efficient, good way to do it. All economists would say that. The US spent decades trying to get cap and trade through Congress and failed. They can't do it with rules. So they do it with cash instead.
But you have to admit that the achievement of getting the IRA through put the US on the front foot. When everybody sort of says the US is down, done and dusted and over and done with, death of empire, goodbye, switch off the lights on the way out, they come up with this and everybody else is left reeling. And the effects will be felt how?
I mean, let me just make 2 points on that. So I completely agree that it's an amazing achievement of the U.S. government, but also of the European governments, of the Chinese government, of governments around the world, that they're finally taking sustainability seriously. But one thing I am concerned about, and I think I'm allowed to be concerned about as a representative of the WTO, that I am worried that the multilateral trading system and the rules-based trading system is going to be the collateral damage of some of these policies, because we already see the trade tensions mounting in Geneva, and it exactly has something to do with what Alan said before. We just have this fragmentation of approaches now to climate policies, and all laudable individually, let me say, but they're not really interoperable, and that's causing difficulties, and that's what some of the consequences are.
I'm going to now do the world is flat with you. So what if the multilateral system goes down the toilet?
Well, I mean, first of all, I mentioned to you before that 75% of world trade is still conducted under the rules of the WTO. Second, world trade is an absolute pillar of our prosperity. I mean, think about it. Why are we rich? We are rich because we exchange, because we specialize, because we have a division of labor. So and I'm not saying, I'm even fine saying the environment is more important, but just approach it in a way that doesn't cause havoc to this.
So in terms of this industry, are they all mutually exclusive? I mean, this industry proved just the significance of trade. during the pandemic.
Insignificance of trade?
No, significance.
Oh, yes.
Significance rate in what it carried, the ability of cargo to ramp up to such a huge, and I mean, you could arguably say trade in terms of passenger traffic as well, which all generates trade in the fullness. But you were telling me earlier that it's a misnomer to think about this as against sustainability.
Oh, yeah, definitely. If we think about sustainability, I mean, you heard the two messages from the executive director of the IEA, so let me add a third message. I think if we think about, and let me talk about trade first, but it's the same about the aviation industry. People always think, people associate trade with transportation, and they associate transportation with emissions, and therefore they think trade is bad for the environment. But it's just kind of a narrow view, because really, emissions are not just transport emissions, but also production emissions. And there's a large variation in production emissions across countries. So to the extent that you connect your customers to greener origins, I call this green sourcing, you're actually part of the solution, even though you might be causing transport emissions. And I think once you take a bit of a broader view on your role in the economy and your role in sustainability, I think you get away from this defensive position.
My favorite example on this is back in the 90s, an awful lot of air-freighted flowers, particularly roses and cut fruit, started turning up in Britain from East Africa. All my friends said, this is appalling. The carbon footprint, the air miles, the food miles is if I could abolish one misnomer, one concept, it's food miles. This is all appalling. If you do it properly, if you do the maths properly and look at it year round, it is lower carbon to grow roses in Kenya, where they do not need heated greenhouses, and fly them, in many cases all you're doing is backfilling empty cargo space anyway, than it is to grow them year round in Europe, including in the Netherlands, in heated greenhouses, right? That's not true for everything.
Exactly.
But the point is, if you're going to do these sums, you need to do these sums properly. You cannot just throw your arms up and say, food miles are bad, air freighting is bad.
Food miles has clearly riled you.
It's riled me because it's something that's absolutely got in people's heads, and it's become a simple... It's become a simple way of people thinking this is how I can live sustainably,
exactly.
which is based on something that's very intuitive, but just does not cohere with the facts.
And I mean, I think what you said is very important, that it's also not necessarily true that trade is always good for the environment, but the key is, if the incentives are set correctly, it really can be an important part of the solution. So let me elaborate on this very briefly. So what we have done is we've kind of simulated world trade and asked, just hypothetically, what would happen if the economist's dream came true? And we had a worldwide carbon tax that properly internalized all the externalities. And then we decomposed, obviously emissions are going to fall, and we asked, what are the sources of emissions reductions? And what we found is that 1/3 of the overall reduction in emissions due to this worldwide carbon tax is through international trade, is through this green sourcing. So it's really important to embrace trade in the fight against
climate change. So why are we losing the argument? That's the next thing we're going to discuss.
I'm trying my best to change the narrative. I really believe that trade is part of the solution.
The reason is it's a lot easier to visualize. It's a long way from there to here than it is to visualize the carbon intensity of production all the way over there. That's why.
Gentlemen, please move down 2 seats. Allow me to invite back to the panel Marie Owens-Thompson. Marie and Dr. Birol. Fatih, would you like to come back, please? You sit next to me, or you sit in the middle. Forgive me. Dr. Marie. Doctor. First names only for everyone. How about that?
Absolutely.
How about that? Before we begin, anyone got a question that they want to throw to the panel before I jump in panel wide? I can see, is there anybody who's itching to ask a question to our... I'm warming you up ahead of the CEOs, so that by the time the CEOs get going, bring your chair forward, sir. So that's it, there we go. This issue that Dr. Birol raised earlier, the reputational aspect versus the reality, is really the core of the issue, would you agree?
Well, I mean, I think, it is obviously very emotional, this issue, and when it is emotional, you're going to lose, right, if you just focus on facts. But as an economist and sort of a research person, it's hard not to focus on the facts. And if I may go off on that a little bit, highlighting how difficult this all is one thing, but we actually believe that it's possible to achieve this. And if I can quote some numbers, if we go at the highest estimates of the investment costs, investments needed for our transition, that will be about $5 trillion. That's 180 billion per year. It's a third of the money that goes in on an annual basis to new oil and gas exploration. So I could stop there and say this is entirely feasible. If we could also redirect the subsidies that go from states to fossil fuel production, that's about 56 billion annually, a third of our investment needs. Second argument for why this is imminently feasible. And it also is totally comparable with the money that's invested in solar and wind on an annual basis. So again, totally feasible. We just have to make investments in fossil fuels an unattractive option, and then we can make real progress towards the
Do
goal.
you subscribe to that?
Partly, I should say. If I was the aviation industry, I wouldn't say that we are making a lot of progress. Because one has to be transparent. The sustainable aviation fuels, this push started, almost 10 years ago. And if we are today, the share of sustainable aviation fuels in the overall fuel consumption is 0.1%.
Right.
It will be very difficult to convince the public that we are making significant progress here. I would try to put in a context that it is really much more difficult than other sectors, such as the people compare aviation with the road transportation, with cars. With cars, you have a commercially available alternative, which is electricity, replacing oil. But in the aviation, you don't have a commercially available alternative. One has to make the public understand the difference of the difficulty here.
Alan, do you think that is that a battle that the industry can win?
Oof, now you're asking me to do PR, to do assessments of PR.
Well, I guess
you can certainly win it with economists. Whether you can win it with the general public or not, I don't know. Just very intuitively, I do notice this sort of shift. When I was a student, early 20s and so forth, you did automatically think of I'm going to go off on holiday to Peru, I'm going to go off to Australia and so on, and kids just don't appear to think in the same way. That may be to do with money, but there just does seem to be this sort of mental shift with regard to air travel. I think obviously to some extent air travel is energy intensive, but as I say before, it's a question of at least making sure that people are making decisions in the awareness of what the reality is, not in a general, I think air travel is bad sense.
I want to turn to the biggest crisis arguably affecting both trade and energy at the moment is, of course, the war in Ukraine. And how do we expect it to look afterwards? Russia, in terms of an energy producer, has shifted its customer base quite dramatically in a way that it's not going to return. Europe is not going to buy ever, even if the thing, please God, ends tomorrow. Russia is not going to return to Europe in that same way.
Exactly. When we look at the realities of life, as of 24th of February last year, Russia was still #1 oil exporter of the world, #1 natural gas exporter of the world, major player in the coal markets, and Europe was by far the biggest client of Russian energy. And now, of course, Europe had a lot of difficulties, but Russia did as well. In terms of oil, they replaced Europe with Asian countries, but much lower prices, much lower discounted prices. They sell the same oil, but sell it at 30 euros less than the market price. In terms of natural gas, it is the pipeline bound, and they don't have an alternative to sell it to the European gas to somewhere else. So therefore, Russia's oil and gas revenues compared to 1 year ago declined by 50%. In my view, Russia played the energy card and it did fail.
They played the card and their bluff was called.
Numbers.
In terms of trade flows in a post-Ukraine environment, how does that look?
I mean, we did actually analyze the kind of near-term effects of the war in a research note quite recently, and it was quite interesting because, again, quite similar to COVID. You know, most of what you read in the news is how trade was such a source of vulnerability and globalization more broadly, and we need to home shore and decouple and whatever. But what you actually saw is that, some of these countries, so we looked at some of the African countries that were heavily exposed to food imports, wheat imports in particular, from Russia and the Ukraine. And of course they suffered initially, but what they were all able to do, at least according to our analysis, is pretty quickly find alternative sources of supply. So Ethiopia, for example, they used to import 45% of their wheat from Russia and the Ukraine. That collapsed, obviously, and they were able to source it now from Argentina, source it from the US, and that's exactly the flexibility that an open and multilateral trading system gives you. And you said before, we don't know what the next crisis is. We don't know if we need face masks, if we need
But the
wheat,
disruption was there.
Absolutely.
And the disruption and the effort required to rebuild that network, as you say.
But sometimes I just don't understand. I mean, how can you expect there not to be a disruption? If there's, people have this expectation that, a war in the middle of Europe shouldn't disrupt supply chains, or like a world pandemic shouldn't do anything to supply chains. I think that's also expecting a little bit too much. But when you see the flexibility and the speed with which we found solutions to this major shock, I think it's quite remarkable.
Alan?
Yeah, two reasons for optimism. One is this, and I would specifically point at the experience of Germany with gas. No one thought that they could reduce their gas consumption and get alternative supplies like that. Bearing in mind, this is a pipeline. This is not just a sort of like the global food crisis, you can get it in from anywhere. There's a huge amount of infrastructure to be done, and it was done remarkably quickly. And if Putin thought he was going to knock out public support in Western Europe for the war by playing, he's lost. You only get one shot at killing your monopsonist, and he's failed. The other thing I'll point out is just look back at the last major global energy shock was the 1970s, like this, okay? Did it cause disruption? Yes, of course it did. Double-digit inflation, governments falling, recessions, eventually high interest rates, and then a debt crisis in the developing world. And yes, absolutely, all sorts of disruption. Did that destroy the global trading system? No, absolutely not. In fact, if anything, it was just part of a continued rise. It will, of course.
So what will that global trading system look like in the post-world?
If we now have a permanently higher level of energy prices, then of course, as the ones in the 70s, as indeed there is now, it's just accelerated what technology is delivering anyway, which is a shift to lower carbon technologies. People will adjust supply chains. I don't call people adjusting supply chains, sorry, value networks, in response to see how I fail to do it every single time. Adjusting value networks and the ecosystem in response to changes in costs. I don't call that a crisis of globalization. That's businesses responding to external environments. That's what they do.
I was in Antalya last week filming, and one of the things we were looking at is the flight path, depending on your airline that you take from Moscow to Antalya. So if you're Pegasus, you go that way, and it comes in at 3 hours 55. If you're the Russian carrier, you have to go, it's diametrically opposite directions that you have to go, and it takes 4.5 hours or something like that. Where does that leave us when we have these, Finnair that can't go over the top? I flew Tokyo to New York, Tokyo to London via the US. These are massive costs to the industry.
Yes, they are, and I will answer that question. But my brain is stuck on our earlier conversation and these numbers and how we communicate this to the public. And I think maybe, we have, of course, been insisting on the fact that our emissions are 2.5%, but maybe the number that we need to quote more frequently is that the emissions associated with fossil fuel production are 75%. Maybe that will focus people's minds differently. 80. Thank you. Yeah. So,
right,
anyway, I just had to say that.
Well, that's just merely passing the blame.
No, why is that more passing the blame than saying that we're only
Because
2.5%?
you're not really responsible for that 80%, in a sense. You can't
But we-
control that. You can control your own 2%.
How? You know, how? We still buy our fuel from the fuel producers, yeah? So what we really need is fuel producers making sustainable aviation fuel, yeah? And how are we going to make them do that? As long as they find it more, as long as they can earn higher investment returns with lower investments from continuing their investments in fossil fuel. So this is a relative value proposition. Somehow we have to engineer the price signals in the economy so that it becomes more interesting to produce sustainable aviation fuel. As long as that is not the case,
We've
then
been
we
talking
will.
about this for as long as I can recall.
Yes, can't say anything about how much you can recall. So,
Yes.
you know, yeah. But should I also try to answer the displacement of traffic
Yes,
question?
please.
Thank you.
And then we'll
So-
come back to you, Alan, on this question of what role government should play. Yes.
Right. So this is obviously very devastating for certain particular airlines, and depending on the geographic location of those airlines and where they want to fly to, and there has been significant revisions of business models in response to this, and I commend. Those who have had to face those problems. But on a global industry level, it remains actually not hugely impactful on the global numbers as a whole. So this is...
The big picture is it's not that impactful, but if you happen to be one of the airlines involved...
Then it's obviously
God help you.
devastating.
Right. Alan, the governments and response, the relationship of governments in terms of, I mean, we're talking about SAF in a particular sense. This industry is screaming for basically governments to fund in some shape or form the increased cost of sustainable aviation fuels. Governments seem reluctant to do so.
I mean, this is not anything I'm particularly expert in, but there's always been, and I know having spoken to people within the European Union who are incredibly frustrated at the slow speed to which they can apply the kind of regulations and so forth that they do domestically to airline fuels simply because it is a global industry. It's almost by definition, it is one of the hardest things to come up with a coherent, even if you did have a coherent plan, you'd have to have other governments and it's extremely easy for any government to undercut others, right, and simply get information that way. One thing that may come up and may be really dramatic is, so I'm slightly off the point now, but the EU has just adopted a new regulation where you can go after companies who are operating within the EU market and are being subsidized by foreign governments. As I understand it, one of the first things that people are eyeing up are the Gulf airlines, because they are coming into Europe and they are clearly being, not necessarily on fuel, but clearly in one way or another, having some backing from their governments. But that's why it's so difficult. It's so difficult to do this because by its nature, it's an international and global market, and regulation of any international market is extremely weak.
You see, that's good.
I mean, I could say something on the governments, but I wanted to come back to a point that I think was raised in your conversation before about the role of carbon offsets and carbon pricing. And I mean, I know that there's all sorts of difficulties with carbon offsetting and so on in practice. I still think, though, that it's an absolutely crucial tool that we must embrace, because I mean, any economist is going to tell you, and it's also so easy to, I think, see that, really. Let me maybe get a step back. If we want to really tackle this climate crisis, I think we have to do it in a way that's economically that's affordable. I think otherwise it's just not gonna happen. And I think these carbon offsets, proper carbon prices are exactly the way to achieve it, because it gets the emissions reductions to happen where they need to happen. And if aviation is hard to decarbonize and someone else does it for much cheaper, that's exactly what should happen.
It's not happening fast enough.
Sure, but doesn't mean we need to throw it away. I mean, just because a good idea doesn't work. I mean, you were talking about the U.S. before. I mean, last year you would have probably said, they're not doing anything anyways. They're kind of dragging their feet. Now you see the inflation reduction. I mean, things can change, and I think we shouldn't just throw away like a good policy tool. Just because it hasn't worked perfectly so far. And if you talk to people, I don't know how the situation is here, but if you talk to people in the logistics industry, they're embarrassed of these carbon offsets, because it's so associated with greenwashing now, as if you're doing something something.
Offsetting, yes.
Yeah, but if you do it properly, it's not. I think it's a perfectly legitimate tool to achieve the achieve.
That lacks the market structure
Sure.
around it and the
Sure.
accounting systems
Yeah,
and the
yeah, totally.
verifications. It's
But let's
lacking
fix that,
the
yeah.
market infrastructure, and let's fix that. And for that, we need the government
Yeah,
to help us.
don't throw away the baby with the bathwater. I would say, no?
Absolutely.
Yeah.
How many people here offset their trip here? Because you paid. Turkish Airlines paid for everyone to offset. Go on. Tell us more.
Turkish Airlines paid for everyone. So everyone's flying to this event has been offset. So we should thank Turkish Airlines. And I would agree with what Ralph says. But under Corsia, we have a scheme that is properly regulated, properly tested, properly audited. So not all offsetting is bad. Yes, there have been examples in the past where offsetting hasn't worked, but that doesn't mean it doesn't work.
What about, since you've kindly joined the panel, hang on, keep going. What about Fatih's point earlier of the two things that the airlines need to do? One of, what was it you said?
First of all, make sure that the public understands that your contribution to global emissions is very small, unlike people think. This is about 2%. Second, it is very hard to abate, but you are doing the concrete efforts, A, B, and C, to minimize, if not nullify them.
Come back in, Director General.
I fully agree. And, Richard, I think you're going to have to give us some credit and acknowledge that on the second point, we're being very loud, very vocal, very direct, that we recognize it's going to be hard and we recognize it's going to be expensive, but we're absolutely determined to do it.
Alan, the trade agenda. Free trade is something that's great for everyone until it hits you, basically. You've covered it long enough to know that this, when it gets into my backyard, it becomes much more difficult, doesn't it?
It does, but I think the debate is or should be moving on from sort of overarching concepts like free trade, not least because the way that policy is now set is not, arguably it never was in big overarching deals at the WTO. It's in whole lots of decisions, and a lot of them would not be labeled as trade either. The huge impact on global tech trade is from the IRA. The IRA has got some trade provisions in it, which they had, some domestic, which they had to get it in to put in to get it through Congress, right? And it will have trade distorting effects because you're encouraging production in one place. And it's huge, but it's not primarily a trade tool as such. So a lot of the impact on global trade will be collateral damage from people doing other things. And conceivably collateral damage from geopolitics, wars, all sorts of things which aren't trade policy at all. So people like me, having happily, gone around a relatively small paddock, now have to recognize that there's this sort of huge landscape now of things that can affect the global trading system. And the whole concept of trade is massively different as well. Goods trade has leveled off. Cross-border movements in data are absolutely exploding. And one thing no one has mentioned are these technologies that not only can we not predict what they're going to do, but the people who invented them can't predict what's going to do either, like AI, This may be the last IATA conference that any of us do. There could be holograms replacing us this time next year, AI holograms.
Can I say something about free
Well,
trade
hang on,
quickly?
no. He's giving me holograms. Do you see AI as existential crisis?
Do you want the absolute straight honest answer?
Yes.
I don't know, and neither do the people who invented it.
Do you?
I don't know either.
No, I think these things can,
No, come on, just stop jumping.
Yeah, so then I would say, I guess I have to plump down on no, because every technological innovation that we've had in human history has created churn, yeah? This is Schumpeter economics, yeah? With creative destruction. You lose certain jobs and you create new ones. And the net result is clearly positive because today we have more people working in the global economy
So
than
who
ever
in this
before.
room is prepared to admit that you've used ChatGPT on some form of work? Well, there's one honest person, 2, 3, 4. How many people don't want to admit that they've used ChatGPT as some form of, much more likely. Have you used it?
Yeah, it's amazing. I mean, in fact, I only just got access recently. It's pretty difficult to get on it. But when you try it out, I think it's fantastic. I mean, you need to double check it. There was a really interesting, so I used to be a professor before, and apparently one professor had an exam where he let the students use it, but the exam was to kind of check what ChatGPT had produced and see how factual it was. So that seems to be a skill of the future, to be able to tell apart what works and what doesn't work.
Final question, and I think you can plead the Fifth Amendment if you wish, because you're IATA. But you're welcome to join it if you'd like. I have the power to make you the airline CEO for the day. Which airline are you going to take? You're last. Which airline are you going to take, Alan? You can any airline that's here. The world's airlines are your choice. I can give you CEO for the day.
BA, only because most people I know will have heard of it, so it'll impress them.
Sean?
For no other reason.
If you're in the room, you're out of a job for a day.
But only for a day. I'd probably be sacked by the end of the first hour, let alone lunchtime. So
Luis?
I don't think I'm much of a threat.
Sir?
I live in Switzerland, so it has to be Swiss.
Oh, Carsten. You go to the Lufthansa group. Do you want to take it?
Can I say the strategy that I would implement? I would insource fuel production.
You would insource the fuel production. But to which airline?
That's for the benefit of the global industry.
Oh, very diplomatic. Sir?
So I am really a frequent traveler.
Yes.
I travel almost all the airlines, even some of those that I don't know the names, because I never heard names. But to be very, very objective, looking from the customer point of view, I would go for Turkish Airlines.
You notice something, Richard? We're all about the globalization, and everyone picks their home airline.
I have to say, though, I flew Turkish yesterday. It was very good, I have to say.
What a bunch of diplomatic wimps. The whole lot of them are. Ladies and gentlemen, our panel.
Thank you so much.
Thanks.
Thank you.